Let me paint a picture for you. You're a combat athlete. You train pretty consistently. You very rarely miss class. You run 3, 4, maybe even 5 times a day. You do a lot of HIIT circuits. Most nights you go to bed beat up and sore. And if you're not feeling beat up from a day of training, you probably think that you're not doing enough, that you're being outworked. You're putting in a lot of effort and a lot of work, but no matter how hard you try, no matter how much effort you put in, you're still gassing out, you're still tiring out when you're sparring or even in a fight. This is really frustrating. Your lungs burn, your arms, your legs, you get heavy. It destroys the mindset and the careers of so many fighters that have great potential of making it far in the fight world. I see it happen with so many athletes. So in today's video, I'm gonna be talking about 3 things every combat athlete needs to be training to have unbeatable cardio. Stick around. What's going on? Coach Adam here. Today we're talking about everything that you need for unbeatable cardio. If you're new to the channel, our mission is fight science made simple. We're dropping videos on strength, conditioning, nutrition for combat athletes, everything that you need to reach your greatest potential on and off the mat. I got you covered. So make sure if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. And if you're in a good mood, we really appreciate it. The support helps a lot. Make sure you like the video so you don't miss out on anything that we're dropping on the channel. Now, when it comes to conditioning for combat sports, so many fighters go to cardio. I need more cardio, I need more cardio, I gotta train my cardio. But the reality is that conditioning is built through various different energy systems, specifically our aerobic system and our anaerobic system. Now, our anaerobic system is basically how we produce, break down energy without using oxygen. It's a very important piece of the puzzle, but for today's video, we're just going to be talking about our aerobic system. This is what most people think about when it comes to cardio. Our aerobic system is basically how we break down and produce energy using oxygen. Our aerobic system primarily comes into play on any kind of exercise, movement, sport that's greater than 2 minutes. So when you think about combat sports, most combat sports competitions are gonna last more than 2 minutes. So the aerobic system is very, very important here. Another reason why the aerobic system is so important is because it's much more fatiguing to rely on our anaerobic energy systems, our energy systems without oxygen, than it is to rely on our aerobic energy systems. We've all been there where maybe we have a really intense wrestling scramble, or we're throwing a large flurry of power shots and our arms and our legs, they just feel like they're burning and they're heavy and they're just full of acid and we're just exhausted. This is because we're mostly using our anaerobic system. So if we can rely on our aerobic system for longer, if most of our sport, whether we're a grappler or a striker, an MMA athlete, can be supplied aerobically, we're going to be able to put a high output out for longer. So we understand why it's so important to develop an aerobic system for combat sport. And this is why so many athletes go on runs and runs and runs, because they know they need cardio, they know oxygen is important, but they don't realize that there's more to developing an aerobic system than just cardio, than just running. There's actually 3 key components that come into play that every combat athlete should be training when it comes to building a relentless, unbeatable aerobic system. And it's gonna give you the cardio to win round after round, fight after fight, without gassing out. So the first component, the first part of building a solid aerobic system is something called cardiac output. Now, cardiac output is exactly what it sounds like. It's the output of our heart. It's how much blood our heart can pump out and supply to the rest of our body. As we know, oxygen gets saturated in our blood, and this oxygenated blood in our heart, it gets pumped out and spread throughout our body. So if our heart can pump and supply more blood, more oxygen, with less work, we're going to be able to fuel our sport, our competition, for longer with oxygen. Now, this cardiac output style of training is probably what most athletes are familiar with. Running is actually a great way to improve our cardiac output. We want to maintain a heart rate of 130 to 150 beats per minute. If you're in better shape, you want to stay closer to that 150 side of things. If you're in not so good shape, then you want to go closer to the 130 side of things. And we could perform this from anywhere to 30 to 90 minutes. And basically what happens is when we work at a slower, more moderate pace, but maintaining this very specific aerobic heart rate, this gives our heart time, basically the chambers of our heart, to expand. See, if we just work hard and we go too intense all the time, we're not giving our heart enough time to grow and expand. We're not allowing the volume of blood that our heart can handle to grow. So this cardiac output method, by maintaining that 130 to 150 BPM for that 30 to 90 minute time, this gives our heart time. It's a chamber. It expands with blood and then it pumps blood out. It expands with blood, it pumps blood out. So if our heart can expand and fill with more blood, that volume will actually grow. The size of that chamber will grow, which means when I'm in a fight, if I'm in a jiu-jitsu competition, if I'm wrestling, if the chambers of my heart are larger than my opponent's, if I can supply more blood with less work than my opponent, then I'm going to be able to outwork them. Now, cardiac output, this method is unbelievable, but I typically do not like to do long runs or long, slow duration exercise. Sometimes it's important, sometimes our athletes actually really like it, but something that I prefer is what's called the tempo interval. I think it's much more sport specific. We could do something like a 6-second run followed by 60 seconds of shadow boxing, and we can maintain that. We can repeat that for the 30 to 90 minute time span. And as long as our heart rate is staying in the same range, as long as we're maintaining it for the same time, then we're gonna get the same heart adaptations. Our cardiac output is going to increase, but we're going to be doing it in a way that's more specific for combat sports. Maybe you're not a striker, maybe you're a grappler. You can do something similar where maybe you run and then like a 6-second run, and then maybe you do 60 seconds of some ab work or some bear crawls or maybe some squeezes, something that's going to be a little bit more specific to your sport than just running and running and running. So cardiac output, it's obviously very important for combat sport performance. It's what most people are familiar with, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. The second area that's really crucial to improve that most people miss is improving what's called our anaerobic threshold. So our anaerobic threshold, we talked about our anaerobic system a little bit at the beginning of the video. This is where we primarily produce energy without oxygen. It's a very powerful, a very effective, a very fast acting system, but it's very fatiguing. You see, anytime we're doing high intensity work, our heart rate is high, we're pushing the pace, there's a large output. We are producing what's called metabolic waste. This is something like CO2 or acid or other waste that is just built up in our muscle and in our body from this high intensity work. Oxygen does a great job of removing that as we're training, but if we're going at such a high intensity that we cannot supply enough oxygen into our body to clear all of that waste out, then we're gonna gas out and we're going to fatigue. Where our anaerobic threshold comes into play, this is basically the line between where we're primarily utilizing oxygen for energy and we're primarily creating or breaking down energy without oxygen. And that threshold is right there. The second we cross that threshold, we go from that primarily aerobic zone to that primarily anaerobic zone. Then the clock starts to tick. Now we're at a point where if I continue to stay in this zone for the rest of the fight, I am going to gas out. Without a question, you're going to get tired, you're going to fatigue. However, if we can take that anaerobic threshold and we can push it, maybe your anaerobic threshold is 160 beats per minute, but through training, we can push it to 170 beats per minute. This means you're going to have a higher output of aerobic work. You're going to be able to use oxygen at higher intensities of work for longer, which means you're going to be able to output a higher level of work when you're in the cage, on the mats, when you're in the ring. So we use a style of training called the threshold method to improve our anaerobic threshold. The idea behind this method is that we are improving the maximum amount of energy that our aerobic system can produce at a very high and a very fast rate. This way we can produce more power aerobically and we can push the pace harder for longer. So how does threshold training work? Well, it's pretty simple. You could do it on something like an airdyne bike, you could run, you could row, you could do sport-related drills. And basically, once you pick your drill, then you're going to get your heart rate within 5 beats of your anaerobic threshold. A really easy way to kind of get a tell of where your anaerobic threshold is basically go run as hard as you can for 12 minutes, wear a heart rate monitor, run as hard as you can, try to sprint for the whole 12 minutes. Basically, what your average heart rate is in that time is a good estimation of where your anaerobic threshold lies, and then you can work either plus or minus 5 beats away from that. So let's say your anaerobic threshold is 165 beats per minute. You want to maintain a heart rate of anywhere from 160 to 170 beats per minute. Once you determine where that anaerobic threshold lies, you want to get your heart rate to that anaerobic threshold, and then you want to maintain it there from anywhere from 3 to 10 minutes. If you're highly trained, if you're in really good shape, obviously the 10-minute mark or close to that is going to be where you want to work. And if you're not as trained or you're new to conditioning like this, then you want to stay around the 3-minute mark. You can do anywhere from 2 to 5 reps per workout. We want to make sure that in between every single rep, we want to be completely recovered here. So we're going to rest until our heart rate comes down to 120 beats per minute before we move on to the next rep. You can do this 1 to 2 times a week, but this is a very intense style of conditioning. But when you get your heart rate to the right level and you maintain it for the right amount of time, this is one of the #1 needle moving workouts that our athletes on the Counter-Strike system do in order to have just completely different cardio. No one can keep up with our guys, and threshold training, improving that anaerobic threshold, is one of the main reasons why. So we talked about cardiac output, we talked about our anaerobic threshold. Now the third piece to the puzzle, and again, this is one of the biggest missing pieces that I see in combat athletes training, is improving our aerobic power. So our aerobic power, it's responsible for a couple things. First, it's responsible for the amount of blood and oxygen that your heart can supply at near maximal intensities. And we talked about in combat sports why this is so important. If you can supply blood and oxygen at high intensities longer than your opponent, you're going to be able to push the pace longer than them without fatiguing. And our aerobic power is also responsible for how hard our heart can actually contract, right? If our heart can be harder at higher intensities, it means that it can supply more blood at those higher intensities with less work. So improving our aerobic power requires one of the most intense and difficult conditioning sessions a combat athlete can do. It's called a cardiac power interval. The cardiac power interval is designed to improve our oxygen supply at near max high intensities, as well as the strength and the endurance of our heart. How does the cardiac power interval work? Well, it's pretty simple. You're going to do something that's going to allow you to push the pace to max, get your heart rate to max effort. This could be on an air bike, this could be running, this could be doing really hard wrestling. I prefer running or an air bike, something like a sprint, to really get my heart rate up. You're going to get your heart rate to max. You're going to reach your maximum heart rate, and then you're going to maintain it there from 60 to 120 seconds. It's shorter work than the threshold training or the cardiac output training, but this is super intense. You are going to be redlined, your legs are going to be fatigued, your arms are going to be fatigued, you're going to breathe really heavy, you're going to have to dig super deep in order to really push yourself. So we're doing the rounds from anywhere from 60 to 120 seconds. You want to do 4 to 12 reps per workout, per session. Again, if you're more trained, you're going to work closer to that 12 rep range. If you're less trained, you're going to be working closer to that 4 rep range. Again, we want to rest until our heart rate comes down to 120 beats per minute. This way we're fully recovered so we can put maximal effort into each and every rep. And you only want to do this again 1 or 2 times a week. It's super fatiguing, it's super taxing, but you do it right and it's going to completely change how hard you can push the pace in your sparring, in your fighting, and for how long as well. Now, like I always talk about on this channel, the style of training that you're going to pick to improve your aerobic system is going to be dependent on where your strengths and your weaknesses are. And I have a couple videos on the channel talking about tests that you can do to determine where you're actually strong, what you need to improve on. It's also going to be determined by when you're fighting, what phase you are in the fight cycle. If you're 8 weeks out from a fight, then doing cardiac output, improving your aerobic capacity, probably not the right time. It's probably a little bit too late. Also, most fighters probably have a pretty decent aerobic base. They do a lot of running. So if you're an athlete that runs a lot, then it's probably better to invest more of your energy into threshold training or that cardiac power training. But as always, if you have any questions, let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to chat anything strength, conditioning, nutrition related for combat athletes. That's all I have for you today. Thanks for watching. Again, make sure you hit that like button and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.